Nobody expected the United States to survive. Not after the war ended, not after the victory parades faded, and definitely not after the chaos that followed. America had just pulled off the impossible. 13 colonies, tired and underfunded, had defeated the most powerful empire on Earth. The British Empire had ruled the seas, commanded massive armies, and crushed rebellions across the globe. And yet, against all odds, the colonies won. Independence was real. Freedom was finally theirs. At least, that's what everyone thought. Because once the enemy was gone, the real trouble began. The war ended, but peace didn't bring stability. It brought confusion, it brought anger, and it brought a level of uncertainty that scared even the men who had led the revolution. Behind the celebrations and speeches, America was already starting to fall apart. This is the part of history most textbooks rush past. There was no strong president to take charge, no national army to keep order, no real system to enforce laws across the states. The country technically existed, but barely. The government could make requests, pass resolutions, and hope for cooperation, but if states ignored them, there were no consequences. In other words, America had freedom, but no control. The new nation was operating under a system called the Articles of Confederation. It was America's first attempt at government, written during the Revolution when fear of tyranny was still fresh. The founders had just escaped a powerful king, and they were determined never to create another one. So they did something radical. They made the central government weak. On purpose. Congress couldn't collect taxes. It had no authority to regulate trade. It couldn't force states to follow national laws. It couldn't even raise a proper army without asking each state for help and hoping they said yes. The states held most of the power, and they used it. Each state printed its own money. Each state set its own trade rules. Some states taxed goods from other states like they were foreign countries. It was less a united nation and more a loose group of rivals forced to share a name. If you lived in America at the time, it didn't feel like one country. It felt like 13 separate ones, all pulling in different directions. Meanwhile, the people were struggling. Farmers were drowning in debt. Veterans who had fought for independence came home to empty pockets and broken promises. Many had been told they would be paid for their service, but the government simply didn't have the money. Courts began seizing land. Families lost farms that had been in their names for generations. Anger started boiling over. Protests spread. Debtors demanded relief. Former soldiers talked openly about rebellion. The same men who had once fought the British were now turning their frustration toward their own government. That scared people a lot, because this wasn't supposed to happen. Independence was supposed to fix things, not make them worse. But instead of stability, America had chaos. Instead of unity, it had division. Instead of confidence, it had fear. Even the leaders were alarmed. George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, watched all of this unfold with growing concern. He worried that everything they had fought for was slipping away. In private letters, he warned that the country was on the brink of collapse, that without change, America could dissolve entirely or worse, fall into tyranny or civil war. And he wasn't alone. Across the states, influential leaders began to realize an uncomfortable truth. The system they had created to protect liberty was too weak to protect the nation. Freedom without structure wasn't working. Liberty without order was pushing the country toward disaster. The revolution had taught Americans how to fight. Now they had to learn how to govern. And that was proving to be even harder. Something had to change. The question wasn't whether America needed a new solution. The question was whether Americans could agree on one before the country tore itself apart. Because what came next would decide everything. A risky idea, a secret meeting, and a document that would either save the nation or doom it forever. By the mid-1780s, it was clear something was seriously wrong. The revolution had ended years earlier, but instead of moving forward, the country felt stuck. Every attempt to fix the problems ran into the same wall. The government wanted to act, but it didn't have the power. The states wanted freedom, but they didn't want responsibility. And the people were caught in the middle, paying the price for a system that simply wasn't built to work. At the heart of the problem was the Articles of Confederation. On paper, it looked like a safe system. Congress existed, states cooperated, and liberty was protected. But in real life, it was a mess. The articles gave almost all authority to the states and left the national government with little more than a title. Congress could recommend policies, but it couldn't enforce them. It could request money, but it couldn't demand it. And when states ignored those requests, there was nothing anyone could do. Taxes were the biggest issue. The federal government had war debts piling up. Soldiers needed to be paid. Foreign loans needed to be repaid. But Congress couldn't collect taxes directly from citizens. It had to ask the states for money. Some states paid a little. Others paid nothing at all. Most were dealing with their own financial crises and didn't see why they should bail out the rest of the country. So the government stayed broke. Trade was another disaster. Each state controlled its own commerce. Some states taxed goods from neighboring states. Others blocked trade entirely. Ports competed instead of cooperating. Merchants were frustrated. Prices were unstable. The economy felt more like a battleground than a recovery. Imagine trying to run a business when every state plays by different rules. That was everyday life in post-revolution America. Foreign nations noticed. Britain still occupied forts in American territory. Spain controlled key trade routes along the Mississippi River. European powers didn't take the United States seriously because it couldn't even control its own economy. Without a strong central authority, America looked weak, and weakness invited pressure. But the most dangerous problems were happening inside the country. Farmers, especially in rural areas, were getting crushed by debt. State governments raised taxes to pay off war loans. Courts enforced those debts aggressively. Land was seized. Families were evicted. People who had fought for independence now felt betrayed by the very nation they helped create. The frustration was no longer quiet. In Massachusetts, it exploded. A former Continental Army officer named Daniel Shays became the face of the anger. Along with other farmers and veterans, he organized protests against the courts that were taking their land. When peaceful demonstrations didn't work, things turned violent. Armed men shut down courts. They marched. They threatened officials. This wasn't a foreign invasion. This was Americans rising up against America. The national government wanted to respond. It couldn't. There was no standing army. No money to raise one. Massachusetts eventually had to handle the rebellion on its own, relying on private funding to restore order. That moment shook the nation. If one rebellion could spread that fast, what would stop another? Or 10 more? What would happen if states started fighting each other? Or if citizens stopped believing in the government entirely? For the first time, people openly questioned whether the United States could survive. The idea of total collapse no longer sounded dramatic. It sounded realistic. Some leaders argued that America needed a stronger central government. Others pushed back hard, warning that any increase in power would lead straight back to tyranny. The country was stuck in a dangerous stalemate, fear of chaos on one side, fear of dictatorship on the other. There was no easy answer, but one thing was becoming obvious. The Articles of Confederation were failing. The system designed to protect liberty was now threatening it. And unless something changed soon, America wouldn't just struggle, it would fracture. Behind closed doors, conversations began to shift. Fixing the Articles wasn't enough. Tweaks wouldn't solve the problem. The entire foundation needed to be rethought. That was a radical idea, a dangerous idea, and for many Americans, an unacceptable one. But desperation has a way of forcing action. A small group of leaders began talking about a meeting, not a public debate, not a nationwide vote, a quiet gathering to discuss the future of the nation. Officially, they said the goal was simple: revise the Articles of Confederation. In reality, something much bigger was about to happen, and it would change America forever. In the summer of 1787, America's future was decided behind closed doors. No crowds, no cheering, no public votes. Just a handful of men walking into a hot, quiet room in Philadelphia, knowing that whatever they decided could either save the country or tear it apart. Officially, the meeting was simple. The delegates were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. That's what they told the public. That's what the states had agreed to. But almost as soon as the doors shut, it became obvious that revision wasn't enough. The system was broken beyond repair. The delegates came from different states, backgrounds, and beliefs, but they all shared one fear. If they failed, the United States might not survive another decade. Some worried the nation would split into rival countries. Others feared civil war. A few even believed Americans might beg for a king just to restore order. That fear hung in the room like thick summer heat. So they made a controversial decision. They scrapped the articles entirely. They wouldn't fix the old system. They would build a new one from scratch. And they did it in secret. Windows were shut. Guards were posted. Notes were hidden. Delegates were sworn to silence. The public had no idea that the foundation of their government was being rewritten. If word got out, the backlash could kill the entire effort before it even began. Inside the room, the debates were intense. This wasn't a room full of men who agreed with each other. These were strong personalities with strong opinions. Arguments broke out over nearly everything: representation, power, authority, and trust. Tempers flared. Voices were raised. At times, it felt like the convention might collapse under its own disagreements. One of the biggest fights was over representation. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states feared being crushed by that system. They wanted equal representation for every state, regardless of size. Neither side was willing to back down. For weeks, the debate went nowhere. At one point, the tension got so bad that some delegates packed their bags and threatened to leave. If they walked out, the entire convention would fail. The nation's last real chance at unity would disappear. The compromise that followed changed everything. They agreed on a two-house legislature. One chamber would represent the people based on population. The other would represent the states equally. It wasn't perfect, but it worked just well enough to keep the convention alive. But that was only the beginning. Another question loomed over every discussion. How much power should the new government have? Some delegates wanted a strong executive who could act decisively. Others were terrified of creating a new king. The memory of British rule was still fresh, and no one wanted to repeat it. Every proposal was weighed carefully, torn apart, and rebuilt again and again. Then came the issue no one wanted to talk about, but no one could avoid: slavery. Southern states depended on enslaved labor. Northern states were increasingly uncomfortable with it. The issue threatened to blow the entire convention apart. Arguments grew heated. Silence followed. Delegates knew that pushing too hard could destroy everything they were trying to build. Once again, compromise took center stage. They struck deals that avoided the issue without solving it. Decisions that kept the Union together in the short term, but planted seeds of conflict for the future. It was messy. It was uncomfortable. But without compromise, there would be no constitution at all. Day after day, the delegates argued, negotiated, and adjusted. Progress was slow. Doubts were constant. Some nights, they left the hall convinced the whole thing was falling apart. And yet, they kept coming back because they knew what failure meant. It meant chaos. It meant collapse. It meant the end of the American experiment. By the end of the summer, they had created something bold: a new framework for government, a system of checks and balances, a structure designed to be strong enough to govern, but limited enough to protect liberty. But writing the document was only half the battle, because once it left that room, it would face its greatest test yet: the American people, and many of them were not ready to accept it. When the Constitution finally left Philadelphia, the real fight began. The delegates knew the document was controversial. They also knew that if Americans rejected it, the entire project was dead on arrival. This wasn't just another law. This was a complete rewrite of how the country would be governed. And a lot of people were not on board. Right away, the nation split into two camps. On one side were the supporters, who believed the Constitution was the only way to save the country. They argued that America needed strength, unity, and the ability to act. Without it, the nation would drift into chaos or collapse under foreign pressure. On the other side were the critics, and they were loud. They called themselves anti-federalists, and they had serious concerns. To them, the Constitution went too far. It gave too much power to a central government. It threatened the rights of the states. And worst of all, it didn't clearly protect individual freedoms. They had fought a revolution to escape tyranny. Now they feared they were building it all over again. The debate spilled into newspapers, town halls, taverns, and churches. This wasn't some elite conversation happening in distant capitals. Regular Americans were arguing about the future of the country over drinks at markets and on street corners. People were fired up. One question dominated every conversation: can we trust this new government? There was no guarantee that the leaders in power would always be good men. What would stop them from abusing their authority? What would prevent a strong federal government from crushing dissent or ignoring the will of the people? These fears weren't imaginary. They were rooted in real experience. Many Americans remembered British soldiers quartered in their homes. They remembered unfair taxes and distant rulers making decisions without their consent. The Constitution, to some, felt like a step back toward that nightmare. Supporters knew they had to act fast. A group of leaders, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, launched a coordinated campaign to defend the Constitution. They wrote a series of essays explaining the document, its purpose, and its safeguards. These writings, later known as the Federalist Papers, were published anonymously. They broke down complex ideas into plain language. They argued that power would be divided, that no single branch of government could dominate the others, that ambition would check ambition. Their message was simple: this system wasn't perfect, but it was safer than the alternative. Without it, they warned, America would fall apart. Still, persuasion wasn't easy. Some states ratified the Constitution quickly. Others resisted hard. In key states like New York and Virginia, the outcome was uncertain. A single vote could decide everything. Tensions ran high. Tempers flared. The future of the nation rested on razor-thin margins. Behind the scenes, compromises were made. Supporters of the Constitution promised something critical. If the document was ratified, they would immediately add a Bill of Rights, clear protections for freedom of speech, religion, the press, and due process. Limits on government power are written in plain language. That promise changed everything. For many skeptics, it was the reassurance they needed. It didn't erase all their fears, but it showed that the new government could listen and adapt, that liberty wouldn't be left to chance. One by one, states began to ratify. The process was tense, close, unpredictable. But slowly, the numbers added up. When the ninth state approved the Constitution, the threshold was reached. The United States had a new government. But victory didn't feel triumphant. The nation was still fragile. The divisions were real. The Constitution was an experiment, not a guarantee. No one knew if it would actually work. No one knew if Americans would accept its authority once it was tested. And that test was coming soon. Because writing laws is easy. Enforcing them is hard. And leading a divided nation is harder than anyone imagined. America had survived its first great internal battle. But the hardest part was still ahead. The Constitution was ratified, but that didn't mean everything suddenly worked. In fact, the early days of the new government were awkward, uncertain, and tense. On paper, the system looked solid. In real life, no one knew how it would actually function. There was no roadmap, no precedent. The leaders of the nation were figuring it out in real time. The biggest question was simple and terrifying. Who would lead it? The presidency was a brand new idea. Americans had never trusted executive power, and now they were creating the most powerful office in the country. If the wrong person took control, the entire system could collapse. Fear lingered that this office could slowly turn into a monarchy. There was only one man everyone trusted enough to try: George Washington. When he accepted the role, it wasn't with excitement. It was with hesitation. He understood the weight of the moment. Every decision he made would set a precedent for generations. If he failed, the Constitution might fail with him. From the start, the challenges piled up. The country was drowning in debt. Soldiers who had fought in the Revolution were still waiting to be paid. The economy was shaky. States were watching the new federal government closely, ready to push back at the first sign of overreach. Then came the taxes. To stabilize the nation's finances, the government introduced new taxes, including a tax on whiskey. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it hit small farmers the hardest, especially those on the frontier who relied on whiskey as a form of income. The anger was immediate. Protests erupted. Tax collectors were threatened. Violence spread. People claimed the government was doing exactly what they had fought against, taxing citizens without real representation or concern. Sound familiar? The situation boiled over in western Pennsylvania, where farmers openly defied federal authority. They refused to pay. They organized resistance. They talked rebellion. This time, the government didn't freeze. Washington made a decision that stunned the nation. He called up a militia and personally led troops to suppress the uprising. It was a clear message. The new government had the authority and the will to enforce the law. The rebellion collapsed without major bloodshed. And for the first time, the Constitution proved it could function under pressure. But unity was still fragile. Political factions were forming fast. Arguments over the role of government, the economy, and foreign policy split leaders into rival camps. These weren't official parties yet, but they were heading that way. Friends became enemies. Newspapers took sides. Accusations flew. Even Washington wasn't immune. He watched the divisions grow with deep concern. He had hoped the Constitution would unite Americans. Instead, it was revealing just how different their visions for the country really were. Still, the system held. The courts began to operate. Congress passed laws. The Bill of Rights was added, protecting individual freedoms and calming some of the nation's deepest fears. Slowly, cautiously, trust began to build. America didn't fall apart. It bent. It struggled. It nearly cracked. But it held. The Constitution didn't solve every problem. It didn't erase inequality or conflict. It didn't guarantee peace. What it did was something far more important. It gave the nation a framework to argue without destroying itself. By the time Washington stepped down, the world was watching. A leader had voluntarily given up power. The government continued. No coups, no kings, no collapse. For the first time, the American experiment looked real. But history wasn't done testing it, because the compromises made to save the nation would return later, louder and deadlier. The cracks that were papered over in 1787 would one day split the country in two. America had survived its near collapse, but survival came at a cost. And the story of that cost was only beginning. America didn't collapse in its early years, but it didn't escape unscarred either. The Constitution saved the nation, but it also locked in compromises that would haunt it for generations. The system worked well enough to hold the country together, yet beneath the surface, unresolved tensions were quietly building. What had been postponed in the name of unity would eventually demand a reckoning. One of those tensions was impossible to ignore: slavery. At the Constitutional Convention, leaders had chosen survival over confrontation. They avoided the issue, stitched together fragile compromises, and hoped time would take care of the rest. In the short term, it worked. The Union held. The government functioned. The experiment continued. But time didn't heal the wound. It deepened it. As the nation expanded westward, the question followed every new state: free or enslaved? Each answer tipped the balance of power. Each decision fueled resentment. Political debates grew sharper. Trust eroded. The same framework that had once prevented collapse now struggled to contain the growing divide. Yet even in conflict, the Constitution shaped how Americans fought. Disagreements didn't immediately lead to anarchy. Elections replaced coups. Courts replaced violence, at least for a while. The system gave people a way to push back without tearing everything down. That mattered, because without it, the United States might not have survived long enough to face its future battles. Another consequence of the early years was the rise of political identity. Federalists and Democratic Republicans evolved into formal parties. Loyalty shifted from shared revolutionary ideals to competing visions of what America should become. Government wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about direction. And Americans had opinions, big opinions. Some wanted a strong national government to compete on the world stage. Others feared centralized power and fought to protect local control. These arguments shaped policies, elections, and culture. They also shaped the language of American politics: loud, passionate, and often unforgiving. Still, the Constitution endured. It was tested by economic crashes, foreign wars, internal rebellion, and political bitterness. And every time it bent without breaking, the idea of America grew stronger. Not perfect, not united, but resilient. That resilience became part of the national identity. The early years taught Americans something critical. Freedom wasn't just about breaking away from a king. It was about building something stable enough to protect liberty over time. That meant compromise. It meant patience. It meant trusting a system even when it didn't deliver quick victories. The founders knew they weren't creating perfection. They were buying time. Time for the nation to grow. Time to correct mistakes. Time to live up to ideals that had been written before they could be fully realized. And that time mattered. Because when future crises hit, civil war, depression, global conflict, the framework built in the 1780s gave Americans something to hold on to. A shared structure, a common reference point, a reason to believe the nation could survive even its darkest moments. The United States almost fell apart after winning its freedom. That's the part most people forget. Independence wasn't the finish line. It was the starting gun. The real challenge wasn't defeating an empire. It was governing themselves. And that challenge nearly tore the country apart before it truly began. But the fact that America survived that moment says something powerful. Not about perfection, not about destiny, but about choice. The choice to argue instead of collapse. The choice to compromise instead of fracture. The choice to believe the experiment was worth saving. That choice didn't end in 1787. It continues today. History often makes survival look inevitable. When we look back, it feels like the United States was always meant to last. Like the Constitution was always destined to succeed. Like the early chaos was just a rough patch on the road to greatness. But the truth is much messier. Nothing about America's survival was guaranteed. In the years after independence, the country was fragile in ways most people never learn about. The economy was broken, loyalty was divided, trust in government was low. Many citizens felt abandoned, betrayed, or forgotten. Some openly questioned whether the revolution had been worth it at all. There were moments when walking away seemed easier than holding together. And that's what makes this story matter. Because America didn't survive because everyone agreed. It survived because disagreement didn't turn into destruction. The founders weren't superheroes. They were flawed men arguing in overheated rooms, making uncomfortable compromises, and hoping they weren't dooming future generations. They didn't solve every problem. They didn't even try to. What they did was create a system flexible enough to evolve and strong enough to hold. That balance was the real victory. Not independence, not military triumph, but endurance. The Constitution didn't erase conflict. It organized it. It gave Americans rules for disagreement. It turned chaos into debate, rebellion into reform, and frustration into participation. That alone was revolutionary. And it came just in time, because without that framework, the young nation likely wouldn't have survived its next challenges. Economic collapse, foreign threats, internal rebellion, political extremism. Every one of those pressures could have shattered a weaker system. Instead, the country stumbled forward, sometimes painfully, sometimes unjustly, sometimes at a terrible cost, but it moved forward. The early crisis after independence teaches us something uncomfortable. Freedom is not self-sustaining. Winning it is only the beginning. Keeping it requires constant effort, compromise, and vigilance. The hardest part of democracy isn't overthrowing power, it's managing it responsibly afterward. That lesson still echoes today. The arguments Americans have now about government, power, rights, and identity aren't new. They're part of a cycle that began the moment independence was won. The same fears, the same hopes, the same tension between liberty and order. America didn't fall apart back then, but it came close. And knowing how close it came changes how we understand everything that followed. It changes how we view the Civil War. It changes how we view political division. It changes how we understand the Constitution not as a perfect document, but as a desperate, brilliant attempt to hold a fractured nation together. The United States wasn't born strong. It learned strength by nearly losing everything. And that's what makes the American story more human than heroic, more fragile than mythic, more real than legend. Because survival wasn't destiny. It was a decision. Again and again. And the moment America almost didn't survive is the moment that defines it most. In the next video, we'll dive into what those early compromises truly cost and how the problems America avoided in its first years eventually came back with devastating consequences. Because some battles aren't lost right away. They wait. The compromises that saved America didn't disappear when the Constitution was signed. They stayed quiet, unresolved, waiting. In the early years, those compromises felt like smart moves, necessary moves. The nation was fragile, and survival mattered more than perfection. Leaders convinced themselves that time would soften the edges, that future generations would figure it out, that unity today was worth the risk tomorrow. But history doesn't forget unfinished business. The Constitution created a framework for power, but it left deep questions unanswered. Who truly counted as free? Who benefited from liberty? And who paid the price for keeping the Union together? As America grew, these questions followed it west. Every new territory reopened old arguments. Every new state reignited debates that had been buried in Philadelphia decades earlier. Lawmakers argued, newspapers inflamed tensions, communities split along lines of economy, culture, and morality. What had once been compromises became fault lines. The same flexibility that allowed the nation to survive its early years also allowed conflict to stretch, grow, and harden. Political disagreements became identity battles. Regional differences turned personal. Trust between states weakened, just as it had in the 1780s, but now on a much larger scale. The warning signs were everywhere. Nullification crises, economic inequality, violent confrontations, radical voices on both sides. Sound familiar? The nation had avoided collapse once before, but this time, the pressure was different. The population was larger, the stakes were higher, the divisions were deeper, and the compromises that once held the country together now felt like chains pulling it apart. The Constitution was tested again, not by paperwork, not by debate, but by blood. The Civil War would prove something no one wanted to admit in 1787. Some conflicts cannot be compromised away forever. Some issues demand resolution, no matter the cost. The founders bought time, but time eventually ran out. And yet, even then, the framework they built mattered. Because after the war, after unimaginable loss, the nation didn't vanish. It rebuilt, it amended, it evolved. The Constitution changed. The Union redefined itself. The experiment continued. That endurance traces back to those early years when America almost fell apart before it truly began. When chaos threatened to win, when fear nearly overpowered hope, when survival was anything but certain, understanding that moment reshapes the entire American story. It reminds us that democracy is fragile, that freedom is work, that unity is not automatic, and that the systems holding a nation together matter most when they're under the greatest strain. America's greatest strength was never perfection. It was persistence. The willingness to keep going when failure felt easier. The courage to rebuild after mistakes. The belief that the experiment, flawed as it was still worth saving. And that belief is what carried the nation forward. From revolution, to near collapse, to survival, to something still unfinished. Because America is not a completed story. It never has been. In the next video, we'll explore how those early compromises finally exploded into the deadliest conflict in American history and how the nation was forced to redefine freedom all over again. This was only the beginning. By the early 1800s, America looked stable on the surface. The government functioned. Elections happened. Power changed hands without violence. To the outside world, the experiment seemed to be working. The nation was growing, trading, expanding west, and calling itself a success. But underneath that confidence, the old fractures were widening. The same arguments that nearly destroyed the country after independence were back, only now they were louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. States still argued over power. Citizens still questioned the federal government. And the meaning of freedom was still deeply divided. Expansion made everything worse. Every time America pushed west, it wasn't just land being claimed. It was ideology. Would new territories follow federal authority or state control? Would they expand slavery or restrict it? Each decision felt like a zero-sum game. If one side gained, the other believed it was losing the country itself. There was no neutral ground anymore. Economic differences hardened regional identities. The North industrialized, focusing on factories, trade, and wage labor. The South relied heavily on agriculture and enslaved labor. These weren't just different economies, they were different visions of America. And neither side trusted the other. Political debates turned personal. Newspapers attacked opponents without mercy. Politicians stopped compromising and started drawing lines in the sand. Loyalty shifted from the nation to the region, from shared ideals to survival instincts. The warning signs were everywhere. States threatened to ignore federal laws they didn't like. Some openly talked about leaving the Union. The same fear that haunted the 1780s had returned, only now it wasn't whispered, it was shouted. The Constitution was holding, but it was straining. Every compromise felt temporary. Every agreement felt like a delay rather than a solution. Leaders knew they were buying time again, but fewer believed time would save them this time around. And then came moments that changed everything. Court rulings that inflamed tensions instead of calming them. Laws that pleased one side and enraged the other. Violence that proved words were no longer enough. Each incident pushed the country closer to a breaking point. What made it worse was that everyone believed they were defending the true America. Both sides claimed the Constitution. Both sides claimed freedom. Both sides claimed the legacy of the revolution that made compromise nearly impossible. Because when both sides believe history is on their side, backing down feels like betrayal. The generation that wrote the Constitution was fading away. The men who remembered how close the country had come to collapse were gone or dying. In their place were leaders who had grown up inside the system, leaders less afraid of breaking it. And once that fear disappeared, so did restraint. America had survived its first near-death experience through compromise and caution. But now, compromise was seen as weakness, caution as surrender. The political culture had changed, and the consequences were coming fast. The Union was no longer just fragile, it was combustible. All it needed was a spark. And when that spark came, there would be no closed-door convention to save the nation. No quiet compromises, no temporary fixes, only war. The story of America's early survival explains why the Civil War was not an accident. It was not sudden. It was not inevitable, but it was prepared for step by step by decisions made decades earlier. The nation had postponed its reckoning. Now it was due. In the next video, we'll explore how America finally crossed the line from argument to armed conflict and why the war that followed redefined freedom, power, and the meaning of the United States forever. Because the question America avoided after independence didn't disappear. It waited, and when it returned, it demanded an answer written in blood. By the late 1850s, America was no longer pretending everything was fine. The language had changed. The tone had hardened. The patience was gone. What had once been political disagreement was now moral warfare. Compromise, the very thing that saved the nation after independence, had become a dirty word. Each side believed that giving an inch meant losing the country forever. The Union was still standing, but it was standing on borrowed time. Every attempt to hold things together only delayed the inevitable. New compromises were passed, not because they solved anything, but because leaders were terrified of what would happen if they didn't. They hoped postponement might calm the storm. Instead, it fed it. The Constitution was being pulled in opposite directions. Some states argued it protected their way of life absolutely. Others argued it demanded change. The same document that once unified the nation was now being used as a weapon by both sides. And that made the conflict personal. This wasn't just about laws anymore. It was about identity, about dignity, about whose version of America would survive. When people feel their identity is under attack, logic stops working. Emotion takes over. Fear did the rest. Fear of economic collapse. Fear of political domination. Fear of losing control over the future. And fear makes people do dangerous things. By now, Americans were openly talking about separation. Not hypothetically, not quietly, openly. Newspapers debated it. Politicians threatened it. Citizens prepared for it. The idea that the Union could break apart no longer shocked anyone. It felt possible, maybe even necessary. What made this moment different from the crisis after independence was simple. Back then, everyone feared collapse. Now, some welcomed it. That shift changed everything. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the breaking point arrived. To one side, his victory represented hope and reform. To the other, it felt like a final warning, proof that their voice no longer mattered within the Union. And so the decision was made. States began to leave. Not in chaos, not in confusion, but deliberately. They declared independence from the Union that had once declared independence from an empire. Flags were raised, governments were formed, armies were organized. The experiment the founders had desperately tried to save was now splitting in two. This time, there would be no convention to stop it. No secret meetings. No careful compromises. No last-minute deals. The moment for delay had passed. The nation that survived by avoiding confrontation now faced it head-on. War wasn't inevitable in 1787, but by 1861, it felt unavoidable. The cost of postponing hard decisions had finally come due. The irony is impossible to miss. America nearly collapsed after winning its freedom because it feared strong power. It survived by creating balance, compromise, and structure. That same system allowed the nation to grow, but also allowed its deepest conflict to grow with it. The founders didn't fail. They did what they could with the world they lived in. But they knew one thing they never said out loud. Some problems can be solved by compromise alone. Some truths demand resolution. And when they are delayed too long, the resolution becomes violent. The Civil War was not the death of the American experiment. It was its most brutal test. A test born from the same question that haunted the nation after independence. Can a free people govern themselves without tearing themselves apart? That question didn't disappear after the war. It still echoes. Because the American story is not about perfection. It's about survival, again and again, through crisis, division, and reinvention. The nation bends, sometimes nearly breaks, but continues forward. And that is where the next chapter begins. Not with celebration, not with unity, but with cannon fire. If you like this video, do subscribe. Thanks for watching.